Welcome to Terrible Lizards, a podcast about dinosaurs with Dr. David Hone and Izzy Lawrence.
Hello everybody and welcome to, it is the best episode of the entire series, for it is the questions episode, and this is where you guys get to put your questions to the brain with the man in front of it called Dave Hone. What's wrong with that?
That sounds like it's on my back with little steering levers.
I think it might be. I think,
fine.
That's how brains work, isn't it? So I think before I ask you the questions that other people want to ask you, I saw an article come out, which will be 2 weeks ago, about the T-Rex. Now, it said, if I can quote this article directly, it says, Dave Hone thinks that T-Rexes were 70% larger than we imagine. Is that what you think, Dave?
Well, sort of, but this is an idea I've been working on with my friend and colleague Jordan Malland in Ottawa for several years, because we've been faffing around with it forever, and it's gone through several iterations. And there is a paper that we have finished and even submitted to a journal, but there is nothing published yet. But we had abstracts for this conference at SVPCA in London and SVP, which was recently in Toronto, and we knew that, particularly SVP, it's a big meeting, they put out press releases, they give access to various journalists to the abstract, that it was likely that someone was going to see it and pick it up and run a story, because it's very obviously a sexy topic talking about giant T-Rexes, which is what we are talking about. And then we got an offer for an interview on like Saturday, a week ago at the time of recording, to do something on Monday. I wasn't available. Jordan was. So I don't know what he said to them.
He said, Dave Hone thinks.
Yeah, right. But what this is the thing, I don't want to talk about it that much because we haven't done the paper yet, but at the same time, it's kind of got out there and we've presented two abstracts. The short version is, this isn't about T-Rex, this is using T-Rex as a model. But the short version is, if you look at almost all dinosaurs, even things like Psittacosaurus and Anchiornis, where we've got hundreds, thousands of specimens, you're not going to find giant individuals. 1 in a 10,000, 1 in 100,000, 1 in a million sized individuals, really, really, really kind of super giant individuals, you're not going to find with that kind of sampling. And ultimately, what the paper is actually about is the problem of everyone arguing about which dinosaur is bigger than which other dinosaur based on a sample size of 3, or often less than 3. And that this is kind of silly when you consider those grounds. In other words, there's a huge online contest between, is Giganotosaurus or Tyrannosaurus or Spinosaurus bigger? Well, Spinosaurus and Giganotosaurus are known for like a sort of partial individual weirdly scaled to other specimens. The idea that that might be representative of a population is just a joke. It just is. We don't know if that Giganotosaurus is the biggest individual of all time or a piddly little one, and they generally were much, much bigger. We have no idea where it sits on the curve. So, yeah, you can guess it's probably somewhere near the middle, but that really doesn't narrow it down very much. And so just writing that statement becomes a bit pointless. It's not really a scientific paper. So what we're trying to do was create something a bit more interesting and say, can we actually stick some numbers on that? Can we look at the growth rate of T-Rex, the sampling rate, what we think we know about their growth and possible dimorphism and population structure of different sizes and the distribution of body sizes of animals that are quote-unquote adult and other things like that, and try and do a bit of maths, well aware of the fact that there's all kinds of caveats and limitations with us doing that, and just see what those numbers look like. And the answer is that, yeah, animals like Sue and Scotty, which everyone goes are like the largest T-Rex, they're the largest ones we found, yeah, but we predict, based on our model, that animals 70% bigger than that by mass, which is quite a big difference because some people have been quoting length, which is very, very different indeed, might exist. That's all we're saying. And the real conclusion of the paper is, given that, why are we arguing about whether or not Spinosaurus is bigger than Giganotosaurus? It's pointless. And
it's
already
fun,
I've seen comments like, I've literally already been told, you only did this to prove T-Rex was bigger. And it's like, no, it's literally the opposite of that. And not only that, but obviously what we're doing applies to every dinosaur, pretty much, and pterosaurs, and obviously almost anything bar ammonites, which have populations of tens of thousands that you can actually measure and count. So, do we think there are giant T-Rexes out there? Yes, I suspect if you ask anyone who've actually thought about population dynamics and body sizes, they would probably say, yes, there are much bigger ones out there, and they'd give you a back-of-the-envelope guesstimate. We've got a more detailed, bigger envelope with slightly more calculations on it, And that's all that paper actually is. But I think it's quite interesting and fun, and that's why we did it. I think the conclusion is important for someone who talks a lot about size of dinosaurs, both in a professional sense when I'm talking about evolution and ecology of body sizes, and also doing stuff like this. And inevitably, it's all flown out the window, and I'm being accused of the exact opposite of what I did, and it's all gone to hell in a handbasket, because that's what happens when the media get hold of something that you haven't actually said and haven't actually written yet. Wait for the bloody paper. There.
Not that he's angry or anything.
I'm not angry, because I saw all of this coming and it still happened anyway, despite our attempts to control it.
I enjoy this because everybody likes it when you go on a
I know
rant.
they do. It's not a proper rant. The rant is less the media and more people who frankly should know better on the internet going, I can't believe you said that. Well, guess what? I didn't.
Of course, but you haven't not said it yet, because we haven't seen the paper that you wrote. Which
well, precisely. So I haven't not said the thing I haven't even said.
You hadn't not said, but you kind of said it, Dave. But you didn't say it. But you might be saying it, and if you are saying it, they've got a problem. But if you're not saying it, it's brilliant. He's got his head in his hands. It's wonderful. So let's keep on the T-Rex theme, though. We got a question from Andreas.
If it's how big did T-Rex get, I'm leaving right now.
No. It's not actually about T-Rex. It is because you study a lot about T-Rex and you know about its running, in quotations, abilities. And you've talked about this in the podcast and on online lectures. Andreas was wondering if Dr. Hone knows anything about hadrosaur running abilities. Were they usually faster than their predators? Were they more likely to have been distance runners or sprinters? Was there a lot of variation with the running abilities of different species in the clade? And this is, I think, simply in terms of, you could put this in reference to T-Rex if you don't know. Do you know about hadrosaurs?
I do a little bit. So, so I'm famously quoted as saying that T-Rex would beat a human Olympic sprinter, because I put it in my talk I did for the Royal Institution, which is now approaching something like 2 million views on YouTube.
Oh, yeah.
And I overstated it a bit at the time, but not that much. So that is a bit of mea culpa. But subsequent to that, there have been new estimates which have brought the speed of T-Rex down further. So now I get snarky comments going, I can't believe he said that on an 8-year-old video, which was relying on a 12-year-old paper at the time.
He's released another video about Spinosaurs. It's much
it's much more up to date. So, this is the way that things go. T-Rex was pretty fast. Once you're big, simply the act of taking long strides makes you quite quick. T-Rex probably didn't run as an adult in the biomechanical sense of having both feet off the ground at the same time, which for a biped, that's all you need. It probably couldn't run. In fact, we did this a little bit with John Hutchinson, at least came in passing with our talk with him a couple of episodes ago. But obviously, juvenile T-Rex are going to be built very differently. I'm sure younger T-Rexes that could do it happily, though at what point they stop, I don't know, and I don't think anyone's tried to look into it. In terms of hadrosaurs, I'm going to try and remember there was a paper by Scott Persons, Phil Curry, and possibly someone else. So Scott did his PhD with Phil, so there's a whole bunch of Persons and Curry and X papers, depending on who they were collaborating with. And they looked at the acceleration of hadrosaurs. And if I am remembering correctly, because this is the problem with doing this without checking your notes and knowing what questions are coming, so it looked like hadrosaurs had a better acceleration, but probably not good top speed or as good endurance, which is kind of what you'd expect. That's really kind of the same thing that you're seeing with a lot of other animals around today.
Hares. If you look at a hare and a fox, a hare really goes bolt, and then the fox kind of, has to take it really by surprise. Or antelope type thing.
Yeah, and as we did talk about with John, you've got this kind of predator trade-off problem for herbivores. Now, in the case of Tyrannosaurs, or T-Rex in particular, of course, that may not quite be true because of the weirdness of T-Rex ecosystems. But in general, you can have multiple different predators around, and it's very unlikely that they're all specialising in the same thing. And as the classic example is to look at somewhere like Africa, where you've got things like hyena and hunting dog, which run and run and run and run and run, and then things like lion and leopard, which burst over a short distance, and then that's all they can do. But as a herbivore, you don't know which of those two is going to come after you. No inverted commas. So evolution, it can select for speed, but then the long distance runners will always get you, or it can select for long distance running, and then case the accelerators will always get you. So evolution is kind of inevitably forced into a bit of a trade-off where you've kind of got to be quite good at both, and you're relying on that vigilance factor and the fact that they're probably, you're not starting side by side and running in a race. You've got a head start of X, and the trade-off is you hope that X head start, coupled with the fact that you're either a slightly better long distance runner than the sprinter or a slightly better sprinter than the long distance runner, is enough to get you away. Or, of course, enough to get you away from from the one next to you.
Exactly. Ultimately, you just need to run faster than
someone else. Yeah, it's the classic joke of the guy's being attacked by a bear and stops to do his shoelaces up. Well, why are you doing that? I don't need to outrun the bear. I just need to outrun you. That's where we're headed. So yeah, if I remember correctly, hadrosaurs better acceleration, probably nothing like as good over the distance. So can they get far enough away that it then doesn't matter? And probably yes, otherwise presumably they'd all have been eaten in the first year.
Yum, yum. Presumably it changes as to, when they're smaller, they might be even more nippy.
Oh, I'm sure. We've been down this path before and we'll go down it again. And this actually goes back to that T-Rex paper. It really does, in that animals don't scale uniformly. Actually, when swimming, they largely do, but that's a different kettle of fish, ironically. But, a 50-kilogram hadrosaur is not going to move the way a 500 one does, and is not going to move the way a 5-ton one does. They're just not. You can't. So when we say not even just hadrosaurs, which is then, of course, an entire clade, but even when you go, Edmontosaurus moved like this and T-Rex moved like that, it's for a given body type and a given mass and proportions, and those are going to change dramatically over growth for both of them.
Exactly. There are a lot more sort of adolescent T-Rex than there are adult T-Rex.
Yeah, probably. I understand where it comes from, both in popular communication and actual technical scientific papers, but it can be really awkward and unhelpful to talk about species X does Y without that context, and that's particularly true of things like biomechanics or ecological occupation.
Okay, so David Lowe has got a really lovely question here, which I want to know more about. Following on from Paul Upchurch's theory about I don't know if it was his theory.
No, the exploding heads was Paul's personal idea, if I remember correctly. Yeah, it was the one he came up with to explain the rare cranial remains.
So following on from Paul Upchurch's theory about sauropod skull preservation, what are both of your favourite marginally plausible paleontological theories? Something that's unlikely, but you would like it to be true.
Oh boy.
Exactly.
I mean, that's the antithesis of what I try and do.
I know.
Because there's lots of mad stuff, which is just...
Yeah, but there's loads of ones that I can do. For example, the little pterosaurs, the agnoregnathids, hugging tea. That's why they've got those little arms, so they
That's
can
not he said plausible, is he?
That is plausible, Dave. People like tea.
That's your counter-argument. People like tea.
Yeah, I think that is an excellent... I mean, I'm saying it's a hypothesis. I'm not saying it's a theory.
Yes, but a hypothesis is based on observation and data, not just made up.
Based on observation, all of those weird sort of jaw parasites that we see in T-Rex...
Or not, there was a paper came out this week suggesting that they're not.
Yeah, exactly. So there is a thing, and I think it's time travelers with guns. So there it is. That they're actually bullet wounds and they've been shot in the jaw, and that's how.
Yeah, they'd look different to that.
But the vaguely plausible ones, unfortunately, I'm no good at. I can only do sort of cartoon style wacky. How about? I don't know if I even want to mention swimming Spinosaurs. Would you like that to be true?
Well, of course they swim, but again,
but
this
not
is people
underwater catching food.
Hilariously misrepresent. No, I wouldn't want that to be true. That'd be very annoying.
No, it wouldn't be annoying, because what if you've discovered the thing that made that true, and then you'd be able to go, "Oh, look, guys," because it'd be cool.
I was wrong all along.
Exactly. That's science. Anyway, have a little think. We might return to you, David, later on in the episode. Okay, David Bax, he wants to know, if you could snap your fingers and have perfect knowledge of the life cycle environment of one extinct animal, which one would you choose and why?
So the scientist in me says T-Rex, which sounds like a boring answer, but it goes back to what we said before about we probably know more about that than any other dinosaur, and therefore the best way of checking our ideas and understanding would be to do that and then see what we got right and what we got wrong and then use that as a model for other things. So it's not the boring, T-Rex is awesome answer. It's the, actually, this probably tells more about what we're doing in paleontology than anything else answer. But given my interest, something like Protoceratops and being able to test some of my own hypotheses about the teeth and the tail and the jugal bosses and how the frill's growing and being used and what that means for social structures and sexual dimorphism and all this other stuff is obviously very interesting and important to me, and that would be great.
See, I think if you're thinking about this the wrong way, because listen, he says, if you can snap your fingers and have perfect knowledge of the life cycle and environment of one extinct animal. So what you need is an extinct animal that was everywhere, and that way you know about all of the environments they were in, and that will give you loads of knowledge about loads of dinosaurs and their environments. So is there an equivalent of an extinct mosquito or rat or something that's everywhere?
Well, there's Lystrosaurus, but that will only tell you about one specific point in time when Lystrosaurus was around a lot, and the world was fairly homogenous at that point anyway, so it may not tell you very much.
Aren't there certain types of like crocodile which were around the entire time and didn't change very much in species, or a species like the equivalent of the coelacanth but in dinosaur?
No, that's the problem. It's like, yeah, you could make a case for a couple of sharks, but then that would tell you about the ocean, and we kind of know what that's like. Was it wet? Slightly salty.
It was wet. It was
Other
wet,
fish,
salty.
right? Tick.
Yeah.
And from a dinosaur perspective, that'd be rubbish. I guess, yeah, probably your best bet is something like one of the ornithocheirid pterosaurs, because we did that with Thaisa this series. They're probably global saurers at certain levels, but even then, they're largely coastal, and so that would or coastal and out to sea. And of course, I'm much more interested in inlandy stuff. But that would be a way of exploiting that question to its maximum.
Jay wants to know: are there any dinosaurs, as opposed to flying or marine reptiles, that evidence suggests have a strongly coast-orientated life, feeding in the shallows, scavenging on the beaches? Dinosaurs. Anything?
Well, yeah. Not. So that's the thing with Spinosaurus. Not really. So there's Spinosaurines, because I'm unconvinced all the North African material is one species, definitely one genus. I don't think so. Probably not. There's like one record from a mangrove swamp equivalent, which you'd expect to be brackish and therefore having a lot of invasion from the sea. But otherwise, they're freshwater animals, so they're not coastal in that regard. Something like Ceratopsuchops, so the baryonychines that I helped name this year? God, time flies.
I know.
No, was it last year? I think it was last year.
It was Rivenraptor and
Riparavenator and Ceratopsuchops. But anyway, those are probably rather more coastal. The one which springs to mind is actually the ankylosaurs, or at least some of them. So, although there are definitely some inland ones, so it's Panachosaurus, which you get from the Gobi Desert. That's not a.
I'm just going to jump in,
animal.
Dave, and say that ankylosaurs are the ones which are low to the ground with the big smashy tails.
Yes, the ankylosauroids are split into the ankylosaurs, kind of proper with the tail, and nodosaurs, which don't have a tail club and instead have big shoulder spines. I'm talking about the collective group of both here. But anyway, yes, there are absolutely properly inland species for these. But there's definitely a study. I want to say it was Don Henderson, and probably like 15 years ago now.
Everything's 15 years ago, Dave.
Yeah,
it used to only be
awful.
10 years ago.
I know. It was. Yeah, I'm trying desperately to avoid it was a couple of years ago. 5, 12, 20. In the late 1800s, the paper was published. Yeah. I'm fairly sure Don Henderson was involved. But anyway, it looked at the locality data of various types of dinosaurs. And yes, if I remember correctly, ankylosaurs were turning up in marine sediments way more often than you would predict. Certainly given that in general they're fairly rare. We find way more hadrosaurs and way more ceratopsians than we do of ankylosaurs. And when we do find ankylosaurs, they're often in brackish sediments or even marine sediments. And while that's probably at least partly linked to the way that they float, and there's been subsequent papers on that Don's been involved in, Caleb Brown's been involved in, Jordan, who we just mentioned at the start, Jordan was involved in those papers, suggesting that actually they probably floated quite well. So you've got this classic kind of bloat and float, it's called. So when big animals die, particularly for a big herbivore, you've got loads and loads of bacteria and rotten stuff in your guts, and you fill up with methane, and if you're in the river, bloop, you float to the surface, and that can take you really quite a long way. There's a great video online of, I can't remember if it's a crocodile or a lion now, but like big African animal trying to eat a dead hippo that has bloated, and it literally explodes and just like showers rotten guts over everything. So there really is real pressure and a lot of gas volume in there. So yeah, look up exploding hippo. I'm sure it will turn up.
But you don't think ankylosaurs were just going down to the beach chilling?
Well, so what I'm saying is I'm sure bloat and float tendency is probably helping that. But I'd be surprised if they weren't hanging around coasts as well, because in my mind, this is one of those, like, not really supported by the data. There you go, plausible hypothesis. Not really supported by the data, because the data's never really going to be able to sort that kind of stuff out. But some of those animals are going to be hanging around the beaches more than others. You know, you get reindeer spending lots of time on beaches eating loads of seaweed, for example, sort of moose in certain places. So I'm sure that some dinosaurs were. I think based on some of the distribution data, ankylosaurs, or at least some of them, are a reasonable candidate for that. But yeah, the evidence is more than a bit.
We've had a couple of requests
mixed.
for a special ankylosaur episode. So
we did an ankylosaur episode with Victoria Arbor in Series 1.
Yeah, no, but that was about Zool specifically and not about all of them in... anyway. We can revisit it, Dave.
We've got stegosaurs to ignore first. We can't start ignoring ankylosaurs till we finished ignoring stegosaurs.
Okay, well, how about we go to the better side of paleontology, and that is pterosaurs. So, have a question from Nathan. How do we know that the pteroid bone in pterosaurs is a completely unique structure and not another crazy modified finger? Am I missing something? So, when you answer this question, Dave, I want to know what bone that is.
So, I'm not supposed to start a sentence with so. I've already started a sentence with so.
No, you are. It's good. I like it.
When you look at the arm of a pterosaur, so... If you look at the arm of a pterosaur, it will have the same basic layout and makeup of bones that pretty much all tetrapods have. You know, they've modified it a bit, quite a lot in the case of weird things like horses and pterosaurs, but the basic stuff is still there. So you have the upper arm bone, the humerus, then you have a pair, radius and ulna, you have a bunch of little wrist bones, then you have the metacarpals, which in us make up the palm of the hand, and then the phalanges, which are the fingers. And that pattern is essentially universal, and really what's only ever happened is we've lost a few bits in various different groups. But that pattern is otherwise universal. The pteroid comes out of the wrist in pterosaurs. So there's no reason to think it's a finger, because that comes before the metacarpals, not after the metacarpals. It's in the wrong place to be a finger. So that's the first reason to think it's not a finger. The second reason to think it's not a finger is actually the makeup of the finger bones in pterosaurs themselves. So they have the three free fingers that can wiggle around, and then the fourth finger is the wing finger. Why are those 1 to 4 and not, for example, 2 to 5 with a missing thumb, or a missing thumb has done something super weird and become a pteroid? Two reasons for that. First of all, when animals do get rid of fingers, they almost inevitably get rid of the fifth one first. There's a developmental pathway which means that fifth one usually goes first, then the first one, so they kind of sub-mirror. So you lose 5 and then you lose 1 and then you lose 4. So little finger, thumb, ring finger tends to be the pattern. So we would expect the fifth one to go first.
And that's why horses are on their middle finger. That's why they run on that.
And cows are walking around on 2 and 3, with 1 and 4 being reduced. The other thing is, in reptiles, actually an awful lot of things, we're a bit weird in that we have nearly equal numbers of bones in our digits. So you've got 2 in your thumb and then 3 in each of your other fingers. Reptiles have a stereotyped pattern where they have 2 in the first digit, then 3, then 4, then 5, and then digit 5 has 4. And that pattern holds true in pterosaurs. So the first 3 fingers have 2, 3, and 4 bones in them, which is what you'd expect for being 1, 2, and 3, not what you'd expect for being 2, 3, and 4. 4 usually only, the actual wing finger usually only has 4, but it's got no claw. So that would be the fifth one. There's a lot of reasons to think that the fingers in the hand are 1, 2, 3, 4 in pterosaurs. So that makes the pteroid not a finger. What actually is it then? Well, in the early pterosaurs at least, it's a little more than a nub of bone. It turns into something much bigger and more complicated in the pterodactyloids, but in the early ones it's little more than a spike. And it's a spike that attaches to the other wrist bones, and the other wrist bones are there. So all the normal ones you would expect to find are still there, so it doesn't look like it's one of them that's been modified, and now it's got an extra one. And that is what appears to have happened, is that it basically gained an extra wrist bone and then grown it oddly. And then later on, it really changes into something very specialist. And again, that sounds like, oh, well, how plausible is that? That's what pandas have. The famous panda's thumb is a highly modified wrist bone. This turns up in a few things. We mentioned Ichi, the gliding dinosaur. That's got a stylopodium. That is an elongate spar, which is a modified wrist bone, which is also what some flying squirrels have.
Is Ichi the Scansoriopter rigid?
Yes, it is a Scansoriopter rigid. So, yeah, having extra wrist bones and then modifying them into weird long structures is a thing, and it's really a thing when it comes to gliding animals. So there's every reason to think that the pteroid in pterosaurs is what are called a neomorph, new shape. It's a new extra bone in the hand that is a specialist wrist bone, and it is not a finger.
I have another question from Nathan, but for me, it says, what colours and or patterns do you think Pteranodon would have on its crest? Now, I think it's going to be slightly disappointing because we've already talked about, as Dave has explained to me, that as mammals, we don't see the full spectrum that reptiles and birds do because we evolved to be nocturnal at some point and that kind of ruined it all. And we've got our colour vision back. We've re-evolved it. And so I would imagine, actually, if you look at a lot of seabirds now who go out to sea and need to be able to see people from distances, when I say people, I mean other seabirds, they all seem to go with very black and white patterning. They all seem to have very striking, very simple patterning. You don't get the big colours that you do in the forests where you're up against a lot of green, etc. So I think it's probably going to be a bit starling-like. So it's going to be very, very dark and black, but then when you go past it, it's going to shimmer with its UV. That is my feeling, because I think it's going to have not feathers, but the filaments on it to give it that UV shimmer. But I'm going really, really black so you can see it, and it looks quite impressive against a pale blue sky. What do you think of that, Dave?
I'd agree with 3/4+ of that.
Yes! That's very good for it. That's like a B+.
The bit I'd probably disagree with is the shimmery iridescent stuff, because again, modern birds do see UV, and the seabirds still don't go in for that.
Starlings are near the sea.
I've long wanted to get round to looking properly into seabird coloration. I offered it as a project for undergrads for 3 or 4 years in a row, hoping that someone would be really into it, because I'm interested in some of the dimorphism in that, and no one ever took it up, and I haven't had the time. But to my knowledge, none of them are really going in for any kind of iridescence and UV patterning, and they're sticking to, as you say, kind of black and white and grey. There's some coloury bits, a lot of gulls have bright beaks. You get the throat pouches of frigate birds, that bright red, and the rest of it. But yeah, guillemots, cormorants, razorbills, auks, puffins, things like this. Yeah, they're black. Even the, prettier, more patterned ones are kind of black and white. I think that's got something to do with them being pelagic and the fact that they're under a lot of bright light, and then light reflecting off the sea, and overheating is an issue, and things like this for a lot of them. But Pteranodon is going to be literally an albatross writ large. So when albatrosses tend to, these big, super long distance soarers do tend to be very white with some black bits on them, I think that's probably much more down to the environment driving coloration and lifestyle more than signalling. The difference obviously is that Pteranodon does then have a big sexy crest on its head, but I think it's the size and shape of that crest which is the sexy bit rather than necessarily the colour. There is a case to be made that animals tend to find novelty attractive, and we know that that is often the case, and therefore that could drive bright colours, even if the bright colour isn't that important in a lot of ways. I think there's some anoles in, I want to say, somewhere down in Indonesia, Borneo region, where they have literally like this rock, paper, scissors relationship between these three morphs, these three colour morphs of male. So like females find the red one more attractive than a yellow one, but the yellow one more attractive than the blue one, but the blue one more attractive than the red one. So depending on what's most popular at the time, there's active selection for the other one, and they just kind of go round and round and round in circles forever without ever settling on one. It's really interesting. So I can imagine something like that's going on. So I really wouldn't rule out some bright patterns and colours on the crest, and maybe even into the beak, which is, I don't know what the question is really about, but I really wouldn't be at all surprised if the rest of Pteranodon was largely white with like black wingtips or some dappling or something.
I really do think that black sticks out. I mean, if you look at the way that warplanes are painted, like a lot of the warplanes that were at sea during the Second World War were painted like light blue and light pink, and that is because those colours just blend in. And you've got this big crest, you want it to stand out, it's got to be dark, it's got to be black, otherwise you're not going to see it.
But then it depends on when they're using it. If they're only using it on some kind of, they all land at some kind of rookery, and then all the males start displaying to each other while standing on a rock, well, actually, then black may not be that relevant. It's that classic
it could be bright white to stand up against a black rock.
Right,
so.
Exactly. You just don't know.
This is from Gutser. Are there any upcoming paleo media projects that one or both of you are looking forward to? This can include both non-fictional media, such as documentaries, or works of fiction.
Well, for those in the UK, I did some filming back in April, May, for a new documentary that was out in the UK just after Christmas. Dinosaur with Stephen Fry. So for those in the UK, you'll be able to see that. I'm assuming it will be sold to the US sooner or later. I think that's kind of what happens with these documentaries. So that will probably turn up eventually, unless they've edited me out. But I'm told I'm going to be in 2 episodes. I kind of have to be in one of them because I'm all over it. The other one, I may or may not make the final edit. And I'm looking forward to seeing how it turns out. The one I'm genuinely looking forward to is the new Netflix series that they dropped a trailer for it like just a couple of weeks ago. Life on Our Planet, I think it's called.
Yeah, with David Attenborough.
And it really does seem to be what prehistoric planet was for dinosaurs for a wider slab of time. So it's got an A-list cast of advisors and the animation looks absolutely spectacularly good. The trailer looked amazing. Everyone was like, this is going to be fantastic. That's coming out some indeterminate time next year.
Other than Dave's documentary, which I can't wait to take screenshots of and get people to edit into memes.
I discovered I was a meme today, apparently, which was unknown to me.
Oh, I haven't seen that one. Is it you going basically?
No, so I did that insider, expert comment on, and it was paleontologist breaks down dinosaur movies, and someone just edited it so it was my face talking animatedly and just says paleontologist breaks down. And that's apparently been doing the rounds without me seeing it before today, even when that's like 9 months old at this
That is very
So apparently I have been memed. And yes, you will look forward to screenshotting and gifing it, because I was forced to act next to an actual actor on a green screen with nothing to look at but a wall, and occasionally being told by the director, look up a bit. Which really helps.
David Bax wants to know, controversial, I think we've done this one, and I think I know the answer already, but just as a very quick, Torosaurus, an adult Triceratops or its own thing? And I think we can both agree it's its own thing.
Own thing, yeah.
We have covered that, so if you want to go back on, I think it would be on the Triceratops episode.
We did like specifically cover it for some time in one of the episodes, and then subsequent. So I mentioned Tiny in that. So Tiny is a small Torosaurus, which was one of the alleged gaps. Is like, oh, well, there's no small Torosaurus, so that's why they're all really big, because they're just late Triceratops. There is a small one. It's not tiny, it's not 6 foot long. It's a healthy size ceratopsian, but it is smaller than any other good sized Triceratops I've ever seen.
Maybe it was just a small adolescent Triceratops to begin with.
And it still hasn't got a formal description or anything like that. And I equally, as I said at the time and I say now, I don't think I'm gazumping anyone's work, because the people at the museum have put photos of it up and go, here's our Torosaurus. It's not very big. Here's some people standing right next to it so you can see how big it isn't. So, as I said at the start, wait for the proper paper, etc. But this is kind of public information at this point. I didn't think Torosaurus was Triceratops anyway, but obviously one of the major lines of evidence put forward was, well, if Torosaurus is its own lineage, you should see juveniles of this. And the counter-argument to that is, well, yeah, but juveniles are pretty rare in general, and Torosaurus doesn't appear to be very common, so we're probably not going to find one for quite a while. Turns out we found one, and it looks exactly like you'd expect a juvenile Torosaurus to look. So another nail in a fairly nailed-shut coffin for the vast majority of people who share my opinion, and I think that is most people who work in that stuff.
Following on, Pachycephalosaurus, Dracorex, and Stygimoloch. Same or different? Now, you've got to explain. I know what a Pachycephalosaurus is. I think I know what Dracorex is, so what's the issue here?
So that's the same thing in that, so Jack Horner, who I'm sure we've mentioned a couple of times, famous paleontologist in Montana, him and a guy called John Scannella and Horner suggested that Torosaurus was a big old Triceratops. They also suggested that, these 3 Pachycephalosaurs are an ontogenetic series. Stygimoloch is a juvenile. It grows into what we call Dracorex, which grows into what we have called Pachycephalosaurus. That one, I think, enjoys rather better support I still have some questions about it. I'm not entirely convinced because there's some interesting things going on with the heads, which I think doesn't really line up and doesn't make a lot of ecological sense. So I'm on the fence, but erring towards that being correct. And again, I think that's true of quite a lot of people who've looked at this stuff. Dracorex, very probably, Stygimoloch, maybe, are part of a growth series of Pachycephalosaurus, but Torosaurus isn't Triceratops. But I'd also, as part of that general one, Horner has said, like, we've got so many of these examples and we've massively overnamed dinosaurs and most of them are just juveniles and they turn into other things and we really need a giant cull of names. That, I think, is completely wrong. We can tell juveniles from adults. Yes, we'll make mistakes occasionally. There are some weird things out there. Even the ones which are coming up, like Dracorex, for example, are things which people flagged at the time. And this is something I think gets missed occasionally, is that a hypothesis can look like the best supported for quite a while, while still not being very well supported and therefore not overly convincing. And I think this problem that you get, and I've seen it come up just again the other day and several other people moaning about this on Twitter, of people kind of treating each new paper as the be-all and end-all and is 100% right. And it's like, it doesn't work like that. Yeah, the evidence was kind of 60-40 or 55-45. So you go with the majority whilst recognising the fact there's some big gaps and this could well be wrong. And there's various things like that knocking around. Raptorex is a good example. So this odd tyrannosaur, and it came out and it was the original paper said, this is a tiny tyrannosaur. It's really quite small. I've seen the skeleton. It's like 6-7 feet long, nose to tail. Which is small because, of course, remember lying it down. It's going to be waist high on me or chest high. It's like, it's this dwarf tyrannosaur, and it's like I looked at the paper and went, that looks like a juvenile. And I asked a couple of other people and they went, yeah, it looks like a juvenile. And then I saw the actual specimen. This is obviously a juvenile.
See, I reckon all we need to do is, if we find a tyrannosaur type fossil with big eyes and really large feet, and everyone go, it's a juvenile, and actually it was a nocturnal wading dinosaur, that will ruin everything.
But here's the interesting thing. So I'm very convinced that Raptorex is a juvenile. Raptorex was an ex-poached fossil, so we don't know exactly when and where it came from. It was described as coming from China. It's probably Mongolian, or the other way around. I can't remember now. I think it turned out to be probably Mongolian and not Chinese, because that's the problem, because curious enough, poachers don't like announcing to which country they've illegally exported an animal from. There's a bunch of Mongolian tyrannosaurs that have been named, some of which are themselves a bit questionable. Everyone's heard of Tarbosaurus. But there's Aeliaramus, there's Bagoratan, there's a whole bunch of others. And I've looked through most of the relevant fossils, or at least a couple of representatives of most of the relevant fossils. And I'm personally quite happy that Raptorex is distinct from all of them. So Raptorex may well be a juvenile, but it's a juvenile Raptorex. It's not just a young Tarbosaurus, or it's the same thing as Bagoratan, or it's going to grow into an Aeliaramine of some description. No, I think Raptorex is Raptorex. It's only known by a juvenile. So yeah, this what is and isn't a juvenile and what should and shouldn't be named and how do you work it out? Yes, it obviously has some problems and we're going to make mistakes occasionally. But the idea that paleontologists have fundamentally been naming loads and loads of juveniles as dodgy taxa, I don't think is true.
Well, you mentioned smuggling and naughtiness with borders then. We've had a question from Mo. It says, I'm a listener from Maine and currently getting a degree in law. As someone who is a huge dino enthusiast and would like to be a little involved in paleontology, what are some legal aspects of paleontology work? I assume there must be some getting permits for excavations and such. Obviously, there's a difference between American and British legal systems, so it's absolutely fine if you don't have an answer for me. I figured it was better to ask than to never know.
Yeah, again, we've touched on this at various times. It's not just US and UK. It's, every country has their own laws. Every country has their own quirks. We talked about some of that with Thaisa earlier in this series. So, as I'm fond of saying, the rest of Germany has different fossil laws to Bavaria. So even within relatively small countries compared to somewhere like the US with, much smaller state units, can mess things around. There are places where everything goes. There are places where absolutely nothing goes. We had trouble in China at one point when we were on a dig because there were arguments over our permits, because I think we had a national permit, we had a province permit, and we had the town permit, but we didn't have the regional national permit. And you just like, it turned out we just didn't have it on us. But it's a slightly odd thing. It's like, you would think if you have a national permit, it lets you do all the ones below. And if you have the exact locality permit, then the ones above don't really matter. But apparently they do. So that was nightmarish in particular, because I was trying to deal with this with my friend and colleague Corwin Sullivan through the medium of a PhD student whose English was pretty good but not great, and that's not to denigrate him because obviously my Chinese was non-existent. But my boss, Xu Xing, had come on the dig and then left the day we arrived because he got called up to North China. Ironically, because that was the discovery of Juchang Tyrannus. He was called up because they've just found a massive tyrannosaur and we need you right now, because they found it when they were digging a hole to drive a pillar into the ground to build a museum and found a tyrannosaur skull. So there's me and Corwin barely speaking a word of Mandarin between us, trying to argue with the local officials who don't speak any English through the medium of an interpreter student who doesn't know the laws and doesn't speak great English. It was not a recipe for conducive discussion over what was and wasn't legal while we're standing there with the police next to us. But it's really, really complicated. And it's not helped inevitably by the fact that very few people know what the laws are. I mean, a good friend of mine works in, well, now she works for a different organisation, but was a customs officer in the UK. And I've asked her, like, what are the rules and regulations about bringing fossil material into the UK and taking stuff out? And what's written down? And who would you speak to about it? And how can I learn more? And do you get any training on this? And the answer is, no, of course we don't get any training on this. We're interested in knives and explosives and drugs and worse things than that, or, you know, downright dangerous things or properly illegal things.
And people.
Yeah, precisely. It's like, you know, fossils don't even make it into the list. Didn't know what there was on the books, didn't even know where to find out. Asked a few other people, they didn't know. So, obviously, as a paleontologist, it's very easy to get up in arms about, oh, how dare people do this? But if you think about it, it's not the priority of customs officials. And they're not going to know the difference between a cast and a real fossil. They won't. Particularly a good cast. You know, of course stuff is getting through the borders. That shouldn't. But also, plenty of it is probably fine if anyone actually knew what the rules were. And it's one of those things where, because again, I know that, you know, we had this taste, lots of people are very anti-fossil dealing of any kind. I'm not quite in that position. But the fact remains, you know, if you want, you can regulate it much, much, much more heavily. But that's really not going to stop stuff coming and going and just being sold openly over counters if no one actually knows what the rules are. I've seen stuff even in the UK, and I've seen stuff and I'm like, that's Chinese, that's Mongolian. But even if I phoned up the Chinese embassy in London and went, hey, I've seen some random fossil stall in South London and they've obviously got Chinese dinosaur eggs, trust me, I'm a real expert and I've been to China and I know all this stuff. They've got better things to do than go and try and argue with this guy to give them up or get the police to confiscate them. And the police have got better things to do. High profile ones make the news because they either are scientifically more valuable or they are monetarily more valuable, or they're connected in some way to something that's more high profile and interesting, like that American guy whose name escapes me, who got done because he'd basically been digging stuff up on federal land and claimed that it wasn't federal land. And obviously that's the kind of thing that the American legal system is quite interested in. I'm quite sure you could go and illegally fill your pockets with ammonites from somewhere and just truck them across the border, and people would stop you, make you empty your pockets and go, that's some weird stones to be taking out, off you go.
Now, we've got like 3 questions, but I sure want to cram in if we can, because I think they're all really quite good. First one, which might simply be a yes or no. David Molly asks, is there any evidence of symbiosis among the Dinosauria?
No, there's no way of finding it.
What, there is a modern one, extant. You get the birds that pick all the food out of the teeth of the rhino.
Well, so there's the plovers which allegedly pluck food out the mouths of crocodiles, and they don't. That's never been demonstrated. You've got oxpeckers and things like that which are pulling ticks and stuff off rhinos and all kind. You know, I've seen them do impala and giraffe, and yeah, that's a more questionable relationship because they also pick wounds open and they'll make things bleed and do other stuff like that. So symbiosis is just an intimate relationship between species. So in that regard, that is an intimate relationship between species. People usually mean mutualism, which is mutual benefit to species.
I'm just going to give Vincent a comment on his symbiosis. You going to go?
Oh, yeah.
There you go. That's Vincent saying he's got it worked out.
So the one I do know is Bucorvus leadbetteri, so the southern ground hornbill, beautiful big red-faced black birds. And they've been seen picking the ticks off of warthogs. So obviously they get a meal and the warthog gets a clean-up. But personally, I'm starting to struggle to call that mutualism, because although they both mutually benefit, it's not like it's an intimate major part of their lifestyles.
It's like an extra snack or an extra bit of irritation gone.
Yeah, the warthog loses a few ticks and the hornbill gets a snack. But it's not some, these aren't clownfish and anemones of kind of thing. So even the extant stuff, I think it's a bit questionable, at least in the way that most people think of it as being these, deep relationships. And then again, in the fossil record, you're just never going to show it.
I mean, I know there's no evidence, but I'd be very surprised if smaller, juvenile dinosaurs, particularly herbivores, didn't gang up together.
Oh yeah, but this is the thing. It's that the difference between inevitably happened and this one did it. I'm sure those kinds of relationships genuinely existed. I'm sure there were this species of hadrosaur and this species of ceratopsian. That one had good eyesight and this one had good hearing, and they ate different food, so they'd obviously hang around together because they're not competing for food and they mutually benefit by being around because of their vigilant system. That's going to happen. Dinosaurs around for 170 million years, 7 continents, thousands and thousands of species. Of course it turned up, but I couldn't tell you it's that one and that one.
Fair enough. Howard wants to know, there seems to only be a few, 3, 5 modern bird lineages that can be traced back before the KT extinction. Does this mean only a few bird species survived? How close did we come to a totally dinosaur-free world? And how sad would that have been? I will answer the last bit. It would have been very sad.
Yeah, so yes, a lot of birds took a hit. So yeah, the idea that the KT extinction happened and dinosaurs and pterosaurs and various other things went and the birds sailed on quite happily, and so did mammals and fish. And no, they got an absolute hammering, you're right. There were loads and loads of lineages around before the extinction, and most of them took a pasting and only a handful survived. Quite how many species? Don't know. We don't know how many there were before. We don't know how many there were after. That's the sample that you need to show that is never going to turn up.
What about all modern extant birds then? Do we think they come from one particular?
No, so a few got over. So there are supposedly, and I think not my area at all, but I believe this is pretty well established. There are galloanceriforms. So you've got basically this. If there's a big split at the base of birds, or at least among modern surviving birds, you've got the paleognaths, which is your ostriches and rheas and things like that, and an odd little group called tinamous, and that's what John Hutchinson was talking about the other day. And then your other big split is to neoaves, which is everything else, and a group called galloanceriforms, which is literally chickens and ducks. And so it's chickens and turkeys and pheasants and ducks and geese and swans and some other waterfowl. There are paleognaths and galloanceriforms in the Cretaceous. So they were already around, and a couple of them got over, and they have clearly then gone on and radiated. There's a femur, I want to say. I can't remember if it's a femur or a hubris.
Duck leg.
One or other in the Cretaceous, which is considered to be an anceriform specifically, i.e. a duck.
Dave, it's a duck in the late Cretaceous. I love it. I love the fact, because even though I know this is not what you're saying, but can you imagine a T-Rex just going down to the water and a load of ducks going whack, 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 and getting out of its way? It's a most beautiful, wonderful thing. I want it to be true. And the fact that we've got a duck leg, I'm so happy.
There's that. It's been doing the rounds the last couple of days on Facebook and Twitter, and it was like, God creates the duck. And it says, waterproof that chicken and give it a kazoo. Yes, that's
okay.
Basically.
The next question, I think, is relevant, and it'll be our final question, so it's going to be a good one. It is, again, from Howard. It's his follow-up question is, could large dinosaurs spread from continent to continent by swimming? And this is what I want to talk to you about the duck. No, that's not a large dinosaur.
Well, according to the opening of Jurassic World Dominion, yes, it's facile for dinosaurs to magically cross oceans within a couple of months and then mysteriously turn up as new species which never escaped from the previous facility because reasons.
That's just plot holes. That's different.
I mean, yes, they must have done, but not in the sense of, I think, of wandering down to the beach and hopping in for a swim and then just going for 3,000 miles. I'm sure that happened. You big animals like that don't just move to new systems through walking and swimming very short distances. Remember, again, a lot of that was possible, and it's possible now in ways that you don't really realise is that that easy. You know, you can go from, you know, were it not for the Panama Canal, you could walk from South Africa to Tierra del Fuego. You know, you can just walk up the whole of Africa, around Asia to Russia, wait for winter and walk across to the US, and then go all the way down America and down through South America. You know, so it's not that hard, given quite a bit of time, but we have what we call rafting events in particular. You know, you get these, you know, basic log jams in massive rivers, and then they wash out to sea, and they can trap animals. You know, there's things like jaguar have been found like 1,000 kilometres off the coast of Brazil, or something ludicrous like this, because literally it's a massive raft of vegetation, you know, hundreds of yards across, proper giant trees, all kind of bound together and matted up. And, you know, that's big enough that rain will fall on it and catch pockets, and there's monkeys and lizards and other things running around. There's stuff to eat, there's stuff to drink. That will keep you going for a few weeks. Certainly a few days, and then most animals can survive a few weeks without food and water, or certainly without food.
But bigger animals can't, can they?
Right, but again, Diplodocus wasn't always 20 tons.
That's true. They were baby Diplodocus.
Right, so that kind of thing then becomes really quite possible. I think people get trapped in these, well, I've never seen anything like that. Oh, there's one record of that happening once. Yeah, there's one record of that happening once in the last century when people have been looking for it. You know, we're talking about spans of millions of years. At that level, it's really not quite difficult for, you know, a 1 in 10,000 year event to happen regularly because you've got millions of years to play with.
Okay then, ladies and gentlemen, boys and germs, that is, I believe, enough of this nonsense. And by nonsense, I mean, thank you very much for your dinosaur questions. They were really good. We've got loads more. So I will have a word with Dave and see if we can't either do an extra questions episode for our patrons, or we might do another live thing again. So basically, thank you so much for all of your feedback, for all of your lovely messages, for all of the patrons as well, for their lovely cash, because this series has happened with the help of an editor, because we've needed that, because we've both been very busy with time and everything else. So thank you for that. You're the reason this continues. Do keep spreading words, hashtag Terrible Lizards. Do leave us a lovely review. The more reviews we get, the more people see it. And I've really enjoyed this series, Dave. So thank you for finding all of those wonderful people to speak to.
And me, obviously. I found me. He was trying to hide under a duvet but was forced out and made to perform on the internet.
I'm not sure when we'll be back because I've got book deadlines over Christmas, so we will try and come back ASAP. When that paper is released, there will be a special Terrible Lizards on it. Even if it isn't put out for another 5 years, we will be there just going, Dave, were they really 70%?
You can ask, I mean, at that point, I'll try and get Jordan on. We can just ask him, or to be more accurate, you can ask him and leave me
I will,
for 5 minutes.
Go, no, that can't be right. So, like I say, thank you so much for listening. Do have a really spectacular holiday New Year season, and we will be back and speak to you in the new year. And until then, should we say RAWR? A proper one. I want a big one. I don't want you just going like, RAWR. I want a big, proper growly roar. Okay, Dave? A Christmassy New Year's Eve roar, even. Okay? So after 3. What
the hell is a Christmas roar?
Well, I suppose it's a roar, roar, roar. But that's ridiculous.
That sounds like Scooby-Doo.
A little bit. But yeah, okay, so I just want a celebration of dinosaur roaring. Merry Christmas and Happy New Year, everybody. Thank you for downloading this episode of Terrible Lizards. For extra content, become a patron on patreon.com/Terrible Lizards. Dave's book, The Future of Dinosaurs, or How Fast Did T.Rex Run, is available to buy now. Do check out Izzy Lawrence's other podcasts and books by visiting iszi.com. Please send questions, suggestions, and other feedback to terriblelizardspod@gmail.com. And catch up with old live episodes on youtube.com/ISZITube. Do leave us a review, it does make a difference, and find us on social media and say hello with the hashtag Terrible Lizards. Thanks again to our patrons. Without your support, we wouldn't be making this series.